There has been a whiskey war raging for years, the battle of the blends versus the single malts. You've got your loyal fanatics that stand behind brands like Johnnie Walker, and your whiskey purists who believe that a single malt whiskey is the only whiskey worth drinking. But before you pledge allegiance to a side, it's best to know the facts. So I'm going to take you through the differences between blends and single malts, and why some whiskey drinkers believe that one is better than the other. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. Now, before we get into it, I'm going to be having a dram during this video, but I'm not going to tell you what it is and whether it's a single malt or a blend until the end. So with blends and single malts, let's understand the definitions first. Now, a single malt whiskey is made from a single distillery from malted barley. It can come from multiple barrels and multiple batches, and these can be mixed in the distillery before being bottled, but when it's done at the distillery, it's referred to as vatting rather than blending. Now in Scotland, to be able to be called a single malt and to display that on the bottle, it has to be made at a single distillery from 100% malted barley. Now with blended whiskey, as the name suggests, it's made with a blend of 2 or more different single malt whiskies, but it's also mixed with grain whiskey. So if a whiskey is called a blended Scotch or a blended whiskey, it's a combination of single malt and grain whiskey. If it is a combination of all single malt and no grain, it'll be called a blended malt instead. Now, as I've said, some whiskey drinkers will maintain that single malt whiskey is far better than blends. Some of the reasons they'll claim this is that single malts will have a more uniform flavour as they come from one distillery, and being 100% malt, there's more flavour in there than being diluted by grain.
Excuse me, good sir. I don't know what inferior swill this is, but I ordered a Lavalier.
Meanwhile, your blended whiskey drinkers will argue that blended whiskey is far more consistent, blended whiskey is usually aged at least 5 years, and while single malt is limited to what the distillery produces, blended whiskey can source the best of the best around the world. In spite of these arguments, many whiskey drinkers may not realise that what they're holding on to is what was promoted by some very old marketing campaigns. Now, probably the most widely known blended whiskey brand in the world is Johnnie Walker. And they actually started with a commercial blend in 1865 called Old Highland Whiskey, before rebranding as Johnnie Walker 2 years later. Now, to get people interested in their blended whiskey over single malts, their marketing campaign basically posited the question, why would you drink a single malt whiskey from one distillery when you can take the best single malts from different distilleries, mix them together and basically make a super whiskey? That was their marketing pitch, and it worked for them. And it'd be great if that's what they were selling. But what they were actually making at this time was only about 80 to 90% corn whiskey that had been distilled to 90% alcohol volume, watered down and aged to the bare minimum. And then they were just adding a little bit of good single malt whiskey to that. Now, because this corn whiskey was so high ABV, it didn't have much character. So the little bit of single malt whiskey that was being added had to stretch out to cover the rest of that whiskey. It meant they could make a whiskey far cheaper than the single malt distilleries were at the time. So the biggest claim from the biggest blender in history at the time was essentially bogus. And you could be forgiven for thinking that single malt whiskey drinkers haven't forgotten this, and that's why they still maintain that single malt is better than blends. However, by the 1940s, many single malt distilleries were facing intense competition from the blended whiskey market, and most of the blended whiskey at the time was pretty unsophisticated. The Glenfiddich distillery was one of many that had an oversupply of old whiskey. So they decided to bottle all this old whiskey, label it as single malt, and market it as being better quality and more real than blended whiskey. In fact, their campaign even stated that single malt was, and I quote, a taste experience no blended Scotch can match. And this approach worked for them too. Glenfiddich has become one of the biggest producers of single malt whiskey in the world, and many whiskey drinkers still maintain that a single malt whiskey is better quality and more real than a blended whiskey. So the whole argument is really just a result of some really effective marketing campaigns. But what is the actual truth in this? Is one better than the other? It'd be a whole lot easier if that were the case. But in reality, there are good and bad blends, just as there are good and bad single malts. What you should really be looking at is what the whiskey was made for, and in the case of blended whiskey, make sure you're assessing the whiskey itself and not the brand as a whole. So if we take, for example, Johnnie Walker. They've done a great job of promoting themselves as a whiskey brand with a premium offering, but they also have an entry-level whiskey. So if you were to take a Johnnie Walker Red Label and compare it to a high-end single malt, the Johnnie Walker label is definitely going to fall short. But it's not what it was designed for. It was basically made to be an entry-level whiskey that you could mix with Coke. Even Johnnie Walker Black Label is really just designed to be mixed with cocktails. But if you look at something like Johnnie Walker Green Label, this is a mixture of Talisker, Cragganmore, Linkwood and Coal Isla. It's a blended malt, so it's all single malts, there's no grain in here, and it is designed to be drunk neat. And it is a good whiskey. I'll often include this in blind whiskey tastings, and even seasoned whiskey drinkers will mistake it for a single malt. Yeah, this bottle's empty, because I drank it. Because it's good. Even for the lower end blends, there is an art to blending. Now, grain harvests will be different year on year, aging conditions in warehouses will vary even in controlled conditions, and whiskey from a distillery will taste a little bit different each year, but a blended whiskey doesn't. So all of Johnnie Walker's core range, from Red Label through to Green, all the way up to their premium Blue Label, they will taste the same every single year. Take Black Label for example. That is a combination of 40 different whiskies, which will all be a little bit different year on year. So the blender's job is to taste all of these whiskies and slightly change the proportions so that the Black Label that gets released today tastes the same as the last batch of Black Label and the one before and the one before. And there's an art to that. And even being a single malt whiskey doesn't mean it's a high-end whiskey. Most distilleries will have an entry-level whiskey that is the youngest and the cheapest of their range, and it's really just designed to put out there and turn funds over to keep the distillery running as they get to age their more premium whiskey selections. And once again, it comes down to knowing what those whiskies are for. Things like Krabby's Yardhead, Glencairn Arboralis, and Loch Lomond Original Single Malt. These are all single malt whiskies, but they're not really designed to be enjoyed at a premium whiskey tasting. They're there for your cocktails, for your whiskey on the rocks, your mixers, which is fine, so long as you're not expecting more from the whiskey than what it was intended to give. Now on the flip of that, Glengrant and Loch Lomond both have some fantastic whiskies in their range. The Glengrant 15-year-old batch strength is a fantastic whiskey that has won several awards at spirit festivals. And Loch Lomond has a wide range of single malt that start at their entry level and go all the way up to an incredibly rare 54-year-old whiskey. So if you were looking for a simple answer of the blends versus single malt debate, I'm sorry, but you're not going to get that from me. You might prefer one or the other, but if you only drink from one camp, you're going to miss out on some fantastic whiskey. Now for most whiskey available in Australia, if you do a quick Google search, you'll find some tasting notes that'll let you know what to expect. But for the most part, you're not going to know whether you like a whiskey or not unless you try it. Speaking of trying different whiskey, I mentioned earlier that I would tell you what I'm drinking at the end. This is Nicker from the Barrel, and it's a blend. It's a blend of single malt and grain whiskey from two different Japanese distilleries with some Ben Nevis Scotch thrown in there. And it's a fantastic whiskey. It's one I keep coming back to, even though I prefer single malts. So if I only drank from single malts, I never would have tasted this, and that would have been a real shame because I love this whiskey. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more, hit the subscribe button, and whether it's a blend or a single malt, enjoy what's in your glass. Slash. Mic check, 1, 2. Michelangelo.
The Ninja Turtle?
Yeah, of course. Cowabunga, dude. Rather than... The whole argument is really an after effect of some really effective marketing effective marketing. So if we take example... Now, even for the lower end blends though, excuse me, you don't want to record that.
Too late.
Oh no. Somebody else moved over there as a distraction.
No, that's exactly
Do you need to go out, girl? Do you need to go out? Are you asking me to put the aircon back on?
Oh, I can see your pits.
What you doing, girl? Do you want a whiskey?